Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Eau Rouge podcast for the third Grand Prix of the year, the Portuguese Grand Prix in Portimao. And we were treated to another decent race, I would say. Not as good as the first two, I don't think, but a good race nonetheless. There were some nice overtakes. And actually, it wasn't 100% clear who was going to come out on top. Certainly not for the first half of the race, maybe until a bit later on. And that's... I think considering the last couple of years that maybe we've had, that, that's something that we want. We don't necessarily want to have a guaranteed winner from the start. Well, let's go through the points then, Chris. A decent race. Hamilton, another win.
Yes, I mean, it was a drive that shows you why Lewis Hamilton is rated as highly as he is, or as successful as he is. He was great. He had some setbacks. He overcame them. When he was passing both Bottas and Verstappen, he looked dominant in doing so. You knew the move was going to stick. It paid off. I know that you, and actually to a degree I, had a lights to flag for Bottas as a prediction before we started, but it managed to deliver despite being, I think, a track with not a huge number of overtaking opportunities outside of turn one.
Yeah, the less said about that Bottas win prediction, the better, I think, because we'll come on to him in a second, because I think he's my biggest talking point for this race. But like I said, we'll come on to it a bit later. But I certainly think Hamilton had to earn this win. He was pretty much challenged the whole way through. I think even when he was in the lead, eventually when he got into the lead, he had to keep his head at times. And he was passed by Verstappen earlier in the race, and then he passed him back and got the positions back. I thought it was some fantastic overtakes down into turn one, which was really good. And then he controlled the race well pretty much, after that. I think that it's one of those where Verstappen is going to have to deal with some of those races where Hamilton is just better, whether it's because he's more experienced, whether because the Mercedes is better on the day, whatever it is. Verstappen, I think, is going to have to come to terms with the fact, and I think he has. I think he's, old enough, and he's experienced enough to come to terms with the fact that there are just going to be days where he cannot win.
Yeah, Mercedes have made up so much ground from pre-season testing. What it must have been like for the engineers who have been behind that, I do not know. But it proved today that Mercedes have made up the ground. You saw Verstappen struggling down the straights, fastest through twisty sector 2. But when it came to just putting your foot down, he had absolutely no hope. And he did well, let's be honest here, to finish ahead of Bottas in the Mercedes. But for reasons perhaps that weren't down to his sublime driving, but it doesn't matter at the end of the day. He was unlucky to lose fastest lap as well. He did really, really, really well in what must have been quite a frustrating drive for him. And actually, I have to say, with every single race that goes past, I'm more and more impressed with Verstappen. I found him a bit immature at first. And there was some daft incidents last season where I sort of thought, oh, Verstappen. But this season, he's done nothing but prove me wrong every single weekend. And it's just nice to see, really.
And we were always going to get that immaturity with Verstappen because he came into the sport at 17. Most drivers, even when they come in at a young age still, they're coming in at 20, 21. They've had their time in the previous formulas to make those kind of mistakes, to be petulant, to be immature, and get that out of their system before they end up in Formula One. And Verstappen didn't really have that because he was 17 when he joined, and he was always going to see like this spoiled brat because he was undoubtedly talented, far more talented than a lot of the drivers that were already on the grid, but he didn't quite have the experience to match it. So I think now he's growing into himself. He's growing into himself as a driver, and he'll have better races than he had at the weekend, but it will, I think, serve him well in the future. But let's talk about Bottas, because I think this was a huge missed opportunity for Bottas. He had pole position. at a racetrack, like you said, where there aren't that many overtaking opportunities. And he obviously had the pace because he set the fastest lap. So he was able to, he had a Mercedes that could cope with the demands of the circuit and with the pace of it. And he took the lead of the race and he just didn't pull away. He just didn't hit home that advantage. And you can guarantee if it had been Hamilton or even maybe Verstappen, who had got pole position, they would have secured that win. They would have gone straight off and won the race. And I think that he will feel really even more disappointed than he felt last weekend in San Marino when he got twatted by Russell. I think this race weekend is going to be more disappointing for him because he had it in his grasp and he lost it.
Yeah, Valtteri Bottas is the king of comeback drives, Sochi 2020 being a prime example. And I thought what was surely going to be Portugal 2021. He has a terrible race. People question his fitness as a Mercedes driver. People link George Russell into the seat. And then the next weekend, Bottas shows his pedigree. He goes out and dominates. And I thought that was going to be the case this weekend. But he just looked lost. And I don't see him in the seat next season. And I'm beginning to wonder if he sees himself in the seat next season. There was arguably less pressure on him this season when it looked like Verstappen was going to be the winner in a hugely dominant car. And Mercedes have fought their way back into it, and he's still being beaten by Verstappen while his teammate pulls off the impossible. Hamilton was incredible at Bahrain. He made a brilliant comeback to second at Imola, and he managed to win at Portimao. And Bottas has just looked second or third best to the other two the whole time in a way that I don't think Sergio Perez, the only other driver in a similar position, perhaps to Bottas, does. Perez, you feel, is unlucky a lot of the time, but is doing what he needs to do, actually. Bottas, you don't feel you can honestly say the same thing in good faith.
I mean, he's behind Lando Norris in the standings at the moment. I know we're only 3 races in, but if you're in a championship winning car, and you believe that you are a rival, a championship rival to Lewis Hamilton, after 3 races, you can't be stuck behind a McLaren, who is the McLaren is not as good of a car as the Mercedes or as the Red Bull. It shouldn't be up in 3rd place, despite no matter how great Lando Norris is, no matter how well the McLarens have been doing this season. Bottas shouldn't be there. And even if he retired from the San Marino Grand Prix, he should have been making up for that in the first race and in this race as well. I think he should be up there. I agree with you. I don't think I see him in the Mercedes seat next season. I think that he has a lot to prove as a Mercedes driver, which sounds harsh because I really like Bottas. I think he's a really good driver and I like his demeanor. I like the way that he kind of approaches Formula One. But it's obvious to me now that the pressure of being Lewis Hamilton's number 2 is actually getting to him even more. It's getting to him more than it did 2 or 3 years ago. It's now starting to really build up because people were like, in his first season in Mercedes, they're like, okay, it's his first season. And second season, they're like, okay, it's his second season. And the pressure just keeps piling and piling and piling. And I think he's going to lose that seat.
Bottas thrives as the underdog. It's why he was so good at Williams, because he was always the underdog and he could excel against the odds. But once the odds were ever in his favour, he was in real trouble because he just couldn't deliver on that promise, which I think is okay. Let's not forget that Valtteri Bottas has actually had a successful Formula One career. He's done very well for himself. And as you say, he's a likable guy. He has won as many Grand Prix as Max Verstappen. He's won 9, which is great. I think that's a really good. He's been second in the title twice, and he's 3rd in his first season. So, that's big. You wouldn't say David Coulthard was a bottler. And yet you would say Valtteri Bottas was. So I think we need to consider how well he has actually done. But also, yeah, that his head is beginning, I think, to go, and he'd do much better reinventing himself as an upper midfield king. I think he has the potential to be an elder statesman. Dare I say it, like Daniel Ricciardo increasingly seems to be. And I think that's actually quite a respectable place to be. Not everyone can be a winner. And I don't know what it is that's preventing Bottas from finding that extra 2/10, but whatever it is, I think we're very quick to say George Russell has got his seat, but Bottas was only 29 seconds ahead of another Mercedes driver in Esteban Ocon, who dragged a pretty dreadful Alpine to 7th. And while I do still fancy Russell over Ocon for the seat next season, Russell didn't have a great race this time. He certainly didn't have a great race at Imola. So if I was Esteban Ocon, would I be feeling quietly confident about my chances of getting into that black and silver car in 2022?
Yeah, and on Bottas, it's true that we're comparing him against the greatest driver ever, and that has to be recognised absolutely. But it's one of those where I think that he qualifies first, and he has the ability and he has the car, to win that race. And you don't get a better opportunity to win a race than when you start from pole, really. So I think that I think he is losing his head a little bit, and I agree with you what you're saying. It's interesting that you mentioned that when he gets into those positions that he just doesn't have that winning formula, and it's interesting that whether George Russell has that as well, because George Russell's been the underdog for the last 2 years, and he's been outperforming that Williams beyond anything. But when it comes down to it, when he was in Mercedes seat, wasn't his fault, but didn't quite get the result that he needed or whatever. Maybe I'm making an unfair comparison there, but still. Okay, well let's talk about Sergio Perez, because he was driver of the day, and he stayed on the same tires for 50 laps, something ridiculous like that. These tires were incredibly old, and obviously it wasn't going to allow him to win the race, but it kept him in contention, and he ended up in a good finishing position. So it was a good race from Checo.
Yes, it was. Now, there is a conspiracy on r/Formula One that, in fact, the reason that Perez was announced as driver of the day late in the race without a points percentage shown is because our Formula One had rigged it for one Nikita Mazepin to win driver of the day, and the bosses at Liberty Media weren't happy about that. But no, I think deservedly, there's a superhuman feat, and it was what Perez has been brought into Red Bull to do. He is, I think, justifying his position actually as having inherited that seat from Alex Albon. It's, as you say, very early in the season, but he's doing okay. He's looking, I think, as good as Gasly or Albon did in the car at this stage. Better, probably, than both. And he was able to play that rear gunner role effectively for the first time in Portimao. What I think Red Bull was setting out to do by slowing down Hamilton to try and get Verstappen into firing range was optimistic. But that is the first time in a couple of years they've had the second car in a position to support the lead driver. And yeah, he performed absolute heroics on those ancient tyres. So I'm excited for the rest of the season from him, because I think we always knew he was a good driver. He's been a consistent point scorer for his entire career. He's had a podium in almost every season that he's contested, with the exception of 2019 and his first season in 2011. And it's nice to see him look like he's going to succeed in the pressure cooker that is Red Bull Racing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that when we compare the seasons of Bottas and Perez, that we look at Perez and say, well, he's been unlucky, and Bottas has, been not that good. But I do think Perez needs to start. Maybe, I don't know. I'm in some kind of mood today, or I just want to dig at some drivers. But I think Perez needs to get a podium now. I think he needs to push on, not just being that fourth place guy. He needs to challenge Bottas, especially as I think that Bottas, like we said, he's losing his head a little bit. He's potentially a bit fragile. Arguably, that's when Bottas is at his strongest. But I think that Perez needs to strike the next race. He has been unlucky, but I want to see him. I don't want to see him being used as a pawn for Red Bull's Verstappen strategy. I want to see him fighting for podiums and for wins. So I'm hoping that we'll get to see that in Spain for the next race.
I'd love to see it happen as well, but I'm not sure that Red Bull operate the same all our drivers at equal policy they did 10 years ago. And I think Sergio Perez has gone there to be a good support to Verstappen and maybe win some races if it goes his way. Partly because Verstappen is looking like one of the best two drivers in the sport consistently. You would absolutely say he's better than Bottas, and I have no doubt there are some people that say he's better than Hamilton, regardless of whether or not they are correct. So what do you do in that situation? Because Red Bull aren't the team they were. When they were clear ahead at the beginning of the last decade, they could afford to let the drivers fight amongst themselves, but they're not that dominant anymore. They're not the way Mercedes have been in the turbo hybrid era. So do they need to play their cards in a manner that allows them to support the lead driver and maximize returns that way, rather than leaving it to fate? Because you can't help but feel, if you had a Turkey 2010 double DNF collision, it would be a much bigger deal for Red Bull in terms of title races, constructors, than it was in 2010, when they could quite frankly afford to double DNF and still win.
Yeah, I think that's it. We're not going to see the Red Bulls fighting on track, are we, anytime soon? They, like you said, they can't afford that. But I want to see Perez and Bottas. I want to see that number two driver fight, actually. And hopefully it will come. And yeah, of course, I think we are expecting Perez to win something this year as well, especially considering the number of races we have in the calendar this year that presents an opportunity will present itself for Perez. We just have to hope he takes it. I want to give another shout out to Lando Norris, because I think he's just doing a spectacular job at the moment. He's the best of the rest so far. And normally what happens is my praise of Norris leads on to you saying something about derogatory towards Daniel Ricciardo. So let's get that out of the way, shall we?
I was actually feeling quite charitable today. I felt like ultimately you can't expect Ricciardo to set the world on fire. He is new to the team, and he is up against a guy who spent his whole F1 career in a variant of that car. So you would expect him to be struggling to keep up with Norris, perhaps. I know that there were a lot of overconfident predictions at the beginning that Ricciardo was going to smoke Norris, and this was Norris's first real challenge, and he was never going to face up to it. But doing a disservice, I think, to a driver that's consistently improved every single season. I fancy Ricciardo to have a podium or two this season. I don't foresee him winning, if I'm honest. I don't think that Daniel Ricciardo is going to absolutely bring single-handed glory back to the papaya and blue of McLaren. But I do think we'll see, as we saw at Renault, by the end of the season, consistent high finishes, good points, and a justification for his move to McLaren. I just think that maybe, as we're seeing with Alonso, as we're seeing with Vettel, as we're seeing with Raikkonen, that younger generation has had just enough time in the car now that they're beginning to make the other drivers look a bit older. And Norris is in his early 20s, Ricciardo's in his early 30s. That 10 years does count for something.
You summed it up. You summed it up there. That's pretty much what I was going to say. I completely agree. I think Ricciardo still does have to get used to the car. I think obviously he had a terrible qualifying, and though that happens to every driver at times, and it's gonna. Unfortunately for Ricciardo, or maybe fortunately, actually, it happened early on in the season, so it makes it look like his start to the season is maybe worse than it actually is. I agree, though. I think he'll put in consistent top 7, top 8 finishes, top 10 finishes definitely. But I think because Norris is now so settled in that team, so settled in that car, I really see, as long as the McLaren keeps improving, I see Norris being there for a very long time. I think that Ricciardo just has to get up to speed with it now, and he's got the experience to do that as well. So I'm looking forward to. I'm really excited about how McLaren are going to do this season, because I just think if you look at how they're doing now, which is very good, they're best of the rest behind Mercedes and Red Bull, and they've still got Daniel Ricciardo to get better, which I have no doubt that he will, and Norris to continue being as consistent as he is. It just means that McLaren are going to be really strong come the end of the season, I hope.
Yes. And I think it'll be interesting to see how Ricciardo reacts, because I think this is the first time in his career he's the underdog. He has now come up against, for the first time really, somebody where you're looking at him thinking, can he deliver? He had the measure of Verstappen in the early part of their teammateship together. He probably had the edge over Vettel, who was beginning to fade. And now we've seen quite how much. I think it does clarify the picture somewhat. He did quite well against Verstappen, and he was definitely the better driver overall at Renault. While I say last season, please remember that Ocon had the best result. Ricciardo had the better season overall. And I think this is the first time we need to see him fighting back from a position of weakness. And if he's anything like Bottas in that regard, he might actually do quite well. It might bring the best out of him. Because I do think if he hadn't left Red Bull, his career would have looked different. I think perhaps he's Fernando Alonso'd himself to some degree in having too many moves that didn't work out. But you can still be a great driver, I think, without a world championship. And I'd be interested to know now how many people still see him as a future world champion. I see him as a future race winner still. But I'm just excited to see a new element to Ricciardo's driving that we haven't seen before. And I think getting up 7 places from the back of the grid up into the points it's always nice to see. It was great to see Hamilton do that last week. It was wonderful to see Perez do that in Sakhir. Ricciardo himself has done it before. And it's just great when you can sit back and think, what a drive that was. Look at all those people he got past. Because as well, for Ricciardo, he was behind Raikkonen, Alonso, Vettel, Gasly, and he had to fight past all of those drivers, which he did, and the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz, who started 11 places ahead of him, to get there. So full credit where credit's due. I'm just looking forward to seeing the new challenges that he's come to face.
So let's move on to our other kind of honourable mentions. I want to talk a little bit about Alpine, Aston Martin, Williams, and maybe we can touch on Mazepin at the end, depending on what kind of mood you're in. I think Alpine had a very good weekend. I think it was a case of the track suiting their car rather than them having improved a lot. But I especially thought Ocon had a great qualifying and a really good drive.
Yeah, Ocon was, for a man who's often forgotten in Formula One, showing why he deserves to be there. He did well. It's hard to say much about him. He's not a man that gets much screen time, but he's improved every race so far this season. And if he can see the sort of improvement in Spain that he saw in Portugal, he could be in the fight for double figures of points, which would also be lovely to see, I think.
Do you expect Alpine to maintain their level of performance for the rest of the year that they had in Portugal?
I don't know, because it was really hard coming into this season, wasn't it? Trying to judge where Alpine were, what were Alpine doing? How were Alpine doing? Then they were terrible in Bahrain, all right at Imola, and looking decent at Portimao. So who knows what they'll be when they turn up in Spain? They could be decent. They could be moving into, say, the slot that McLaren found themselves in towards the end of last year. Now that McLaren have assumed the place that Racing Point were. But equally, they could fall back down to below Aston Martin. So let's wait and see. I don't think I can predict it, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Well, you mentioned Aston Martin there. Their disappointing start to the season continues.
What has happened to Aston Martin? Like, I just don't understand how they could be so poor. I think that you can at least say that Lance Stroll is the better of the two drivers. He wasn't this weekend, but to be out in Q1 is really unacceptable for the team that should really have come third last season. It was only 5 races ago that car was winning from the back of the pack. And now you see it. You see that British Racing Green. And much like the British Racing Green of Caterham, it looks geriatric. So maybe the problem is British Racing Green. Please be aware, teams. Don't paint your cars that colour. But it's not going right in the slightest, is it? I understand the rule changes have affected the low-rate cars. We saw that with Mercedes. But Mercedes have sorted it out. And
quickly as
yes,
well.
Very quickly. But Aston Martin, so they're going backwards.
I think for Vettel as well, he had his best qualifying since, what was it, Silverstone last year? First time he got into Q3 since then. And he still finished 13th. Just limping home to that rubbish position, those awful positions of like 11th down to 17th, where they're just midfield obscurity. That's not where Aston Martin should be. I would have more respect for them, I think, if they're at the back of the grid rather than in those horrible positions. 13th and 14th for Vettel and Stroll is really poor, and I don't know what's going on. Like you said, the rule changes, yeah, okay, they have an effect, but good teams, and they are a good team. You don't just suddenly lose what you had from the season before. Good teams sort it out, and I don't really know what's going on with them at the moment, but hopefully they will sort it out. Maybe it's just some teething problems at the beginning of the season, and they will get to grips with the car eventually and figure it out. But yeah, I'm a little bit concerned. I'm concerned because Vettel, I don't think is on it, despite his good qualifying. I think that Sebastian Vettel, a 4-time world champion, if he qualifies in 10th, he should be getting in that top 10. He's good enough to do it. Stroll as well has shown that he's a decent driver. 3 places up from where he qualified. It's not ideal. It's not great. So I'm a little bit worried, but hopefully they can sort it out in Spain.
Yeah, Spain should appeal to the engine power of the Mercedes cars. So hopefully, but yeah, it's the problem with being a small team is it can be hard to make those big gains back. Now I know that Aston Martin see themselves as a big team, but this is, I think, when we'll find out what the team is made of. If they can fight back and get the car in decent regular point scoring shape, then they'll have done well. But it's not looking likely at the moment, is it? They're just looking like if they don't improve, they're going to end up fighting the Williams. And it's not what anybody wants to, especially after all that goodwill and excitement they came into the sport. So yeah, what else is there to say about it? Really, it's just a bit rubbish.
So 2 final mentions. So Russell had a really good qualifying, his best ever qualifying, only to then plummet back down to near the back of the grid. They just didn't have the race pace, and in fact Latifi was beaten by Mick Schumacher, which I think Chris and I, we watched the race together, and we were cheering Schumacher on to get past Latifi, because I think that, that shows that he's improving and he's getting better, or Latifi's getting worse, one of the two. But yeah, Williams didn't look, despite the fact they had a car close to the points, they never even looked like scoring any, did they?
No, it was the worst race in a few for Williams, really. You don't often see Russell looking lost, and Russell just looked lost. Well done to Schumacher for getting past Latifi, but I think that was more the weakness of the Williams than the success of the Haas. Having said that, honourable mention to Nikita Mazepin, technically not last, but hopelessly off the pace. There's a little note next to his name on Wikipedia says, Nikita Mazepin received a 5-second time penalty for ignoring blue flags. He did not lose any places as a result, which is true. But yeah, do you know what? Mick Schumacher's looking like he's got what it takes. Nearly everybody, myself included, said Schumacher's slow in a new series. We shouldn't expect anything of him. We'll see how he looks this time next year. But he seems to have taken that big step forward already. So, yeah, I watch his career with great interest.
Yeah, long may it continue. So next we have Spain coming up this weekend in Catalonia. I think it's going to be a bit of a procession. I think it's going to be Mercedes dominated as well. I think we're going to see a Hamilton first and a Bottas second, which is going to extend the lead of the championship up a little bit. That's just my pre-race opinion. Chris, agree, disagree?
Yeah, I think it's going to be the case, isn't it? It's in many ways a similar track to Portimao, and the Red Bulls didn't have the legs to sustain it. The question mark is, will Valtteri Bottas do enough to come second? You would imagine that a Mercedes 1-2 would be a big blow to Verstappen's title ambitions. He's getting closer all the time, but Hamilton's just got what it takes to keep him away. And I think if Hamilton can do it in Spain, it's going to begin to make people ask questions as to whether or not it is Verstappen's year. There was so much enthusiasm at Bahrain and a great first overtake at Imola. But apart from that, there's not really been as much cause for celebration as Christian Horner and Max Verstappen might have liked.
Well, thank you so much for listening once again to the Eau Rouge podcast. Please give us a like and subscribe as well. That would be really helpful for us. And like I said before, if you have anything that you want to add, if there's anything that you think we've missed out or anything you want to agree with or disagree with us on, please leave a comment. We're really keen to hear what you think about all that's going on in the world of Formula One. And we will see you next weekend for Spain.